Good to see you, Yochanan.
And you, Dan. Good to see you.
We're here again with another episode of the Tzur Institute for Biblical Research podcast. We are here to pique interest in reading the scripture, especially amongst Israelis. But today we're speaking in English, and we're here to talk about Psalm 2. Last week we spoke of Psalm 1, and we're looking forward to speaking about the connection between the two and between those two and the rest of the Psalter. But today our focus is on Psalm number 2. Shall we dive right in?
Yeah, let's go.
We have several things ahead of us. We want to talk about both the speakers in the psalm, the whole structure of it, and how the beginning connects to the end. So we have a whole program ahead of us. Let's begin by reading it, shall we?
Yeah, go ahead. You're going to read it?
With pleasure. Why do the nations rage and the people plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, "Let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us." He who sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall hold them in derision. Then he shall speak to them in his wrath and distress them in his deep displeasure. Yet I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree, the Lord had said to me. You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance and the ends of the earth for your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. Now, therefore, be wise, O kings. Be instructed, you judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and y'all perish in the way, when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all those who put their trust in him. It's quite the psalm.
Yeah. It's quite an amazing psalm, isn't it? I mean, it's right at the beginning of the book, and we'll talk in the next podcast about, begin to talk about how that is significant for the whole book. But here, we just want to look at what it's actually saying. And one of the things we were talking about earlier was this very interesting structure, right?
Yeah, there seems to be, if not a monologue, perhaps a dialogue, but maybe there are more than even two speakers going on here. When we start reading the psalm, we get this question about the nations and the peoples. Let's call that speaker the poet, right? Mm-hmm. The author, the poet. He's raising this question: why do the nations rage and the people, or peoples in plural, plot a vain thing? And he describes it to us. The kings of the earth, they set themselves against the Lord and his anointed, against Yahweh and his Messiah. And then he goes ahead in verse 3 and he quotes them. He quotes those kings and those rulers who say, "Let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us."
So up until here, you're saying we have two voices. The voice of the poet.
Yes,
and
verses 1 and 3.
Of the voice of the nations, which he's now quoting.
So to speak, it seems like the poet is bringing in their words. Mm-hmm. Reading the English translation makes it very convenient. I was reading out of the New King James, and my volume here has quotation marks, which really denotes, there's a speaker coming in.
Right.
However, afterwards, the poet resumes. From verse 4, he resumes at least until verse 5, and he continues to describe the reaction in the heavens. He who sits in the heavens shall laugh. What is he laughing at? We're going to get into all those details. The Lord will hold them, those kings, in derision, and then he, the Lord, shall speak to them in his wrath and distress them in his deep displeasure. Verse 6 has more quotation marks for us. And we have another speaker. Yet I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. Who do you make this out to be in verse 6, Yochanan?
Well, it's as he says, it's the Lord who scoffs at them. Mm-hmm. And maybe we'll come back to that later, because there's a couplet here between the Lord and his. We read it, the Lord and his anointed one in verse 2. Later we'll see the Lord and his king who he sits on Zion. And then later the Lord and his son. And the anointed and the king and the son are in the psalm obviously the same one. Then we'll come back to the question, well, is he who sits in the heavens laughs and the Lord scoffs, could that be also the two figures? So here it looks like it's the Lord speaking to them in his anger, and this is what he's saying now in verse 6.
So when we're saying the Lord, we're talking about God sitting in the heavens and scoffing at the kings of the earth who plot against him and his anointed.
Yeah.
And he declares that he has set his king, his anointed one, on the hill of Zion. Verse 7, however, seems to be bringing in a different speaker. This is not God anymore, at least not God in the heavens, because he is mentioning the Lord.
Well, he speaks in the first person, doesn't he? He says, I.
Yes, I will declare the decree, the Lord had said to me. So if the Lord, these are all caps, by the way, the Lord has said to me, Yahweh, God has spoken to me.
So maybe just that's important to make a little note here, because in the English translation, where the Lord is in capitals, it invariably indicates that the Hebrew is Yud He Vav He.
The tetragrammaton,
right.
As some people would pronounce Jehovah or Yahweh.
Right. You can see, for instance, in verse 4, where you also have the Lord scoffs at them, but it's not in capitals, and that's because, I don't know if it's in the King James Version in capitals.
Ah, that's interesting. The New King James does have it all caps, and that's how they interpret it.
So I'm looking here at, that's very interesting. I'm looking here at the New American Standard.
Yeah, so
they have not capped the Lord in verse 4, and the reason is because that's the spelling is in the Hebrew Aleph Daled Nun Yud, which is Adonai. It's actually spelling out the word Adonai,
which literally means a Lord in Hebrew.
Right. But often is used to indicate also the Lord is God himself.
This is fascinating. Well, there are more layers to peel here behind the Hebrew and the translators' choices between the New King James and the NASB.
But if we come back to verse 7, the speaker is now saying that I will tell of the decree of the Lord. So he is talking about something that the Lord
had said to him.
And what does the Lord say to him?
And now
you are my son.
Yeah, this speaker is now quoting God.
Right.
And God had spoken to him, the Lord had spoken to him, saying, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, right, my son or my anointed, ask of me and I will give you. What will I give you? I will give you the nations for your inheritance and the ends of the earth for your possession. You, my anointed, my king, my son, you shall break them with a rod of iron, and you shall dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. End quote. And the speaker finishes his word. And
so this is an amazing statement by the one who in this psalm is presented as the anointed one, and we'll get back to exactly what that means, the anointed one. But we can see that here the anointed one is also his king, like we see in verse 6. I have installed my king upon Zion.
The king that God has installed.
Right. And he's also, according to the words that he quotes from the Lord in verse 7, my son. So he's both anointed one and the king, the Lord's king, and the Lord's son.
The Lord's appointed king.
And he says what has been given to him now.
And in light of all that was said, the speaker, the poet, the author returns and draws a conclusion. He's so to speak, he's answering the initial question, why do they rage? If all this is true, if God sits in the heavens and he has appointed a king on his hill in Zion, why do they even bother? They have no power to do so. And so he resumes and he says, now therefore, be wise, O kings, and be instructed, you judges of the earth. Fear the Lord and serve the Son. That's how he concludes. And so we have these, the beginning and the end is bracketed by the poet.
Right.
He brings in words from the kings of the earth, followed by words from the Lord in heaven, followed by words of the appointed king on earth.
Right.
The Lord's king.
And then he returns to his own words, which is really interesting because this bracketing of this psalm, which we also saw in Psalm 1, right? We saw that the end returned to the beginning in various ways. And here we see, again, the end returning firstly in as you say, the voice, the speaker. The poet is now speaking at the beginning. He speaks at the beginning, he speaks again at the end. But also the content. Because at the beginning he talks about the kings and the kings of the earth and the peoples and the rulers taking counsel. And at the end he comes to the conclusion after this conversation between the Lord and his king, his son. And his conclusion is that these kings should now show discernment. They should take note of what has been going on here. And there are other things that also connect the end to the beginning. One is a very interesting connection of a use of Aramaic.
Interesting. Yes, go ahead. Unveil a little bit of the Hebrew, or in fact Aramaic in this case.
Well, it's very interesting that in the first verse, the words which in this translation, which is again is the New American, why are the nations in an uproar? What does the New King James have?
Rage.
Okay, rage. Well, that word in Hebrew is ragshu. And that actually is an Aramaic word, which also appears in Daniel, the book of Daniel in Aramaic.
We should say it only appears once again in Daniel.
In Aramaic.
Right. It has several chapters written in Aramaic, not in Hebrew.
And the question then is, well, why would the poet use this Aramaic word when he's talking about the Gentiles? And I think here there are two reasons. One is because then he connects it with the end of the psalm by using an Aramaic word also at the end, which is the word where in verse 12, do homage to the Son, which in Hebrew is nashku var.
Mm-hmm. Do homage, or literally kiss the Son.
The Son. So there are arguments about what var means with different commentators, because
let's just clarify. The word written here in the original is val.
Right.
Val or var is also not quite a Hebrew word. It's rather
right. It's
another Aramaic insertion into this Hebrew psalm.
It's an Aramaic word, although there have been attempts to understand it as more close to Hebrew, meaning maybe a word which could mean pure, but then it's difficult to understand what it's talking about here. And in the light of the rest of the psalm, where he's talking about the Son, it seems very clear that it's talking about kissing the Son. There's a very interesting verse in the end of 1 Kings, chapter 19, where Elijah has said to God that he feels that he's the only one left remaining. And God says to him that he has left 7,000 knees that have not bent to Baal, and 7,000 who have not kissed him. So there, the kissing of someone is giving homage to him. And here, in contrast, it's giving homage to the Son that's been talked about. But the point that we're making here is that, so here again, the Aramaic word for son is used as opposed in the middle of the psalm. And so one of the reasons, again, is to connect the end of the beginning. And we've already seen this connection through both the voice, the speaker, who is the same speaker at the beginning and the end, and also through the content. He's talking about the kings of the earth, but also this Aramaic term, which there's one Aramaic term at the very beginning, one Aramaic term at the end, which also connects. But the second reason is very interesting, And one of the commentators has made this point, and I think it's a very good point, that they're both in contexts where they're talking about the foreign kings. And in those days, the language of the foreign kings would have been Aramaic. And this happens in various other places in the Hebrew Bible. When talking about foreigners, certain words that are foreign to Hebrew are sometimes used in their speaking or in speaking about them.
Well, this makes total sense. If you have a word to the kings surrounding you, and those kings speak predominantly Aramaic, that was like the common language of the time, the lingua franca, it only makes sense that you turn to them in their own language, or at least use a few key terms that they would pick up on.
So again, we see this beautiful structure here, which is very powerful also, in connecting the end with the beginning. And if we look now at what the psalm is actually saying, we can see that connection of the end of the beginning is very powerful in its message, in the message to these kings and the message to us as well.
You brought up this issue of not just the speakers, but the characters in the psalm. You were talking about the beginning connects to the ending. That they call that in technical terms an inclusio.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to the characters, it seems like we have what you'd call couplets. For instance, in verse 1, you have these two parts. Every verse seems to be bipartite. So the question would be, why do the nations rage? Why do the people plot a vain thing? So
this is called also parallelism.
Parallelism.
Mm-hmm.
So the nations and the people parallel each other. And the following verse, you have the kings of the earth paralleling the rulers. But then, and the verse after that, or rather the next part of that verse, who do they all plot and take counsel against? Plotting or setting themselves and taking counsel together all parallels one another. But then you have the Lord, or Yahweh, and his anointed. Mm-hmm. So these are two characters who none would argue, nobody would argue against saying that these are distinct characters. Yahweh is one distinct character, and his anointed is somebody else. His anointed ostensibly would be either David or the descendant of David, the king, right. A righteous king.
And maybe we should just talk a little bit about this word Mashiach, because it's Messiah, right? It translates into Messiah, but what does that actually mean in the Hebrew scriptures?
Well, that's a very interesting one. Messiah gets such a heavy overtones later on, but when you're reading the Hebrew Bible, it doesn't appear so often. Where it does appear first is in terms of anointing Aaron and later his sons
as high priest.
As high priest, and then as workers and priests of the tabernacle. Later on, you see Saul as king over Israel being anointed, and after him David is anointed, even though in secret.
So what you're saying is the Mashiach can be both the priest and the king.
Yes. This you're almost. This could open a whole new can of worms, which we will not go into. Zechariah chapter 6, etc. Right. But yes, those are. I want to say job holders, but I'm looking for a better term to say it. These are high titles, offices,
they hold roles, yes,
roles and offices. The highest offices of the land. The high priest and the king are both anointed as they enter their role.
And it's interesting that in both those cases that you mentioned, both Aaron and Saul and David, it was actually the Lord's decision, and the anointing symbolized the Lord's putting them in that role. It was his decision.
Yeah, that's a good point. If people will recall in 1 Samuel 24, and again in 26, when David is hiding and running away, fleeing from Saul, he has a chance to slay Saul as king. His friends tell him, God has given you this opportunity, take it. And later his heart is trained within him, and he says, how could I even raise a hand against the Lord's anointed? Literally in Hebrew, right. The Messiah of God. So when we speak of Messiah in those terms, we're not yet speaking of what will later be known as the Messiah, son of David, who will either come or return and bring world peace. However, when we come back to the psalm, it's a little hard to think, how do we set this historically? If you listen to some rabbinical interpretations, they will strain to place this perhaps between the time of David and Solomon, when David is already very old and his reign is receding. He's now in his bed, cold, laying with Avishag for warmth. And Solomon, who's going to enter, is such a young child that perhaps the kings surrounding them, all the kings that David subjugated, are seeking to break the bonds and break away from Yahweh, this local God of Israel, and his anointed king. Maybe. But as we look further down into verses 7 and 8, you're pushed into either saying this is just pure figurative exaggeration, all the nations, all the ends of the earth, or else something else is going on here.
Yeah, and we'll see specific things also that indicate that this is more than David or one of his sons who we know. I mean, we know that David sinned also, and maybe we'll talk about that in a later podcast as far as the message of the whole Psalter is concerned. And we know that his sons were all compared with him. If you read the book of Kings or Chronicles, it's always comparing his sons. He walked in the ways of his father David, or he didn't walk in the way of his father David. But even his father David, their father David, was not the perfect king. Whereas here we see something very interesting, and that's one thing. But at this point in the psalm, we haven't yet got to God talking about the king, so we don't exactly know what he's talking about, but I think it's already showing us one very clear thing, that in comparison with what these kings and leaders are planning, and that's the important point here, they're planning, and their desire is to get rid of God's sovereignty over them, to detach themselves from the Lord's rule. And that is both a specific thing that can happen in specific circumstances, but we can also see that as something that, as we look in the world system, that we see here also a description of the world's system that is wanting to divulge itself of the Creator's rightful place.
It's looking at this part in the early part of Psalm 2 and thinking of what you're bringing up, it's really hard not to see Psalm 2 as sort of a not a pivot, but certainly a pin almost in the middle of the Bible between the beginning, where you have man and woman, Adam, and later she'll be named Eve, making a choice. Those two were given everything. The world was created, a garden was planted, fruit, trees bearing every sort of good fruit were put in that garden, including the tree of life, which was not forbidden, and one more tree, the tree of knowledge. And those two were told, have of everything, work and tend the garden, and then soon afterwards they make this choice. And the choice follows on the heels of a question. Has God really given you everything? We're not here to speak of Genesis chapter 3, but still I think it's pertinent to the issue of the kings wanting to dislodge or unyoke themselves from God.
So you're saying it goes back to the temptation of the serpent.
Yes, the imagery there is of mankind, woman first, but man soon after, realizing, at least in their mind, that God really isn't giving them everything. Or at least he's holding something back from them. And maybe what he's holding back is actually the best part. And in fact, he's doing so because he's afraid. God is afraid that the day that they eat of that fruit, of the knowledge, they will be wise and like God. And so she takes of the fruit. In fact, it's interesting, she sees that it is good. She's already a little bit like God. God sees that it's good 10 times in the previous chapters. Now woman sees that it is good and pleasant to the eyes, and she picks it, takes a bite, and passes it to the man who's there beside her. And in this action, they make a choice to unyoke themselves
Right.
from
And that
God.
led to the inevitable consequence that God had already warned about of death coming into the world.
At the end of the canon, if you include the New Testament into this, I mean, I may be jumping the gun, but in the book of Revelation, which really comes at the end, and for good reason, there's a phrase that keeps recurring. It recurs first in chapter 2 of the book of Revelation. He who overcomes, I will give him a rod of iron to rule over the nations. It comes again in chapter 12 when John, the author, sees a vision of the woman in labor giving birth to a child who will rule the nations with an iron rod. Finally, in chapter 19, towards the end of that book, the rider on the white horse appears from the heavens, and his name, it eludes me right now, but
It's the Lord of hosts, isn't it? It says there.
the Lord of lords and the King of kings. It's written on his thigh, and all the host of heaven is following in train, and a sharp sword comes out of his mouth, and he strikes the nations. And it still says in the future tense, and he will rule them with an iron rod.
Which really, really echoes what we're reading here in Psalm 2.
It echoes, but all that in the book of Revelation is still future tense, even in the book of Revelation.
Right.
What follows chapter 19 is finally Yeshua, Jesus, sitting on his throne. And then you have 1,000 years after the initial judgment, 1,000 years of his reign. And towards the end of those 1,000 years, that millennium, Satan is released once more, and he gathers the kings of the earth for one more rebellion. It's hard not to think that maybe this psalm ought to be placed, historically speaking, that far in the future. Why do the nations rage? Why do the kings plot a vain thing against the Lord, against Yahweh and his appointed king?
And maybe really the kings are feeling at this point that they are able to do that. And so the Lord in heaven laughs. And I love the way that this is built, because, again, the first thing we're told that the Lord laughs at them. Mm-hmm. He who sits in heavens laughs. And at that point, we're not told exactly what kind of laughter this is, but it's obviously that, is this just humoring him? Or we find later that it is actually bringing him to anger. But the first thing is, he laughs because it is ludicrous. Mm-hmm. that these people, in his eyes, and the nations, and maybe if we take it as the world system, is thinking even that they can do that. And they're doing that against the Lord himself. He is the creator, and against the one who he has decided that will be the anointed one. And they want to divulge themselves of that. They want to rebel against that. Mm-hmm. And the Lord laughs, and then he scoffs at them, which we'll talk about in the next podcast. Goes back to what was the wicked were doing in verse 1 of chapter 1.
Don't let on too much.
Don't let on too much. Well, but here the Lord is actually, this is something which, again, is ludicrous in itself. How can these people who see themselves as all-powerful, and if we think about a lot of the way that the world is thinking today, in Israel there was stickers on cars. I remember especially 15 years ago, when there was a lot of new age ideas coming in, and there were stickers on a lot of cars which said, "I am." Mm-hmm. And it wasn't referring to the Lord. It was the idea that it's me. I am able to do. I'm the one who makes my own meaning or makes my own whatever. And that echoes what is being said here, and the Lord scoffs at that because we can't do that.
So there's a sense in which this psalm speaks universally in all generations, also without its either historical or yet future setting. It speaks also to us. We all bear this vestige, if not even more than a vestige, of what man and woman initially did, just unyoking. Right. So he repeats he tells them in his wrath and his deep displeasure, I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. And that's it, period. That's all the Lord says in this psalm.
And I think just before you go on here, I think it's also important, this process that we see going from laughing to scoffing to anger. Mm-hmm. And, we don't so much like to talk about God's anger. But here, God is angry. And he's angry exactly at man, whether they be kings or whoever, thinking that they are able in themselves to be independent of him. Mm-hmm. That makes him very angry. And he then declares what he has decided. And that's what you're about to mention.
It's the following speaker that there's something there I want to elucidate when we speak of the son and begetting, because the next speaker comes in, and now granted, when we come to verse 7, the part about I will declare the decree, some could read that as the beginning of the quotation of the next speaker, the son or the anointed. Others might say that just that first part could be the poet once again, bringing to the reader what was written in the decree. And then the quotation might begin. But regardless, either way, the Lord had said to me, and here comes the appointed king, the anointed one, says what God had spoken to him. Whether this is David or the future son of David or the past son. He said, you are my son, today I have begotten you. This language, one cannot read this in Psalm 2 and not go back to David and the promise made to King David. Mm. Namely, in the book of 2 Samuel chapter 7. It was then that King David had conquered Jerusalem. He had set his house there, and God had, the chapter starts with these beautiful words, now it came to pass when the king was dwelling in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around. Then David starts setting his mind to the fact that if he has rest from all his enemies, and he has a nice dwelling place in a palace, ought not the Lord also to have a proper dwelling place? And he thinks of the Ark of the Covenant, and of the tabernacle that's in ruins in
Shiloh,
thank you. Yes. And so even the tabernacle that was in Shiloh, and now he wants to build a house for God. And God sends Nathan the prophet saying, oh, that's such a great idea that you thought of me to build a house for me, but I didn't ask for a house. And in fact, since you were so considerate, I'm going to make you a house. And he promises him this. I'm reading from verse 12. When your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, in other words, when you lay down to die, I will set up your seed after you, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I, God is speaking, I will be his father, and he shall be my son.
Say again where that comes from.
This is 2 Samuel chapter 7, and I was reading verses 12 through 14. Mm-hmm. Now, the rest of verse 14 reads, if he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the blows of the sons of men. It's interesting because the next king is a son of David, and his name is Solomon. And as you read the book of 1 Kings, the author really props up Solomon almost as an Adamic figure, like the second man. He builds the temple of the Lord. He speaks parables of the trees, of the birds, of the crawling things. He's everything that could possibly be. But then the author also brings him down, pointing out some key iniquities. And so he's also beat with a rod of men, so to speak. God raises an adversary for him. And then all the rest of the book of Kings compares those kings to David, and none of them matches up. And so you could say that the book of Kings is in search of the king, the son of David, the anointed one who will come. When you read the parallel in 1 Chronicles chapter 17, you have the same promise made to David, only the author of Chronicles, who probably writes all of this after the fact, after the exile, after the kingdom has fallen, he no longer mentions the iniquity of the son. He's looking for a son of David who has no iniquity. I think when we're reading Psalm 2, we're talking about that son, the expected anointed one who has no iniquity. And I suppose this also goes back to Psalm 1 that we will connect in the next episode. Who is this son? Who is this man who is so blessed?
Right. And another very important and interesting indication of that this goes beyond David and the sons that we know, is what it says about that the very ends of the earth will be his possession, because this expression, the ends of the earth in Hebrew, is very interestingly found in several places which talk about a future messianic figure. In Psalm 72 it appears, and several other places in the book of Micah it appears, and in several contexts where it's talking about, in Isaiah it appears as well in connection with this figure, about this future king who will also be savior, and we know historically that didn't happen in the time of David. So we're looking here at a person, and if we actually just mention again in the New Testament, it's very interesting because this phrase, which is today I have begotten you, which could have several meanings in the Hebrew. In the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, it's generically used to point to Yeshua, Jesus' being actually being one with God. But then in the book of Acts, chapter 13, and this is really interesting, in chapter 13 of the book of Acts, verse 33, it's quoted referring to Jesus' resurrection from the dead. And so it looks like it was taken there as being understood as the beginning of a certain role. And Yeshua in the New Testament is called the first fruit from the dead. So it's just interesting, this.
In other words, what you're saying is that the begetting here doesn't speak of his actual or natural birth. Today I have birthed you, which is what the Hebrew literally says. He hasn't birthed him that day. Rather, this is speaking about his coronation. Today I have begotten you could mean today I have appointed you to this role of king.
That's what it seems to be, yes.
Echoing back the words of the promise to David, I will set his throne and I will establish his kingdom, and I will be a father to him and he will be a son to me.
Right. And then we see in verse 9 what he also goes on to tell him about, the son is quoting what the Lord has said to him. You shall break them, the ends of the earth, that will be your possession. You'll break them with a rod of iron, you shall shatter them like earthenware. So he's being given this authority, or he has this authority, which makes him the absolute ruler. And the next verses where the poet comes back to speak, then comes back, and now he talks to the kings who they have spoken, and he says, take heed of this. Take note of this. This will be what will be. God has declared it. And now you need to take note of this. And if you are wise, this is what you will do.
He implores them, be wise. or at least maybe he admonishes them. I mean, this appointed king has total authority and power to completely break you. You spoke of our dislike or aversion to speaking of God's anger and wrath, and indeed, this imagery is it's alarming. On the other hand, the word comes right afterwards, calling people to avoid this sort of fate, calling the kings, avoid it, be wise, be instructed, serve him with fear, rejoice with trembling.
That is a beautiful, I love that, because it's like rejoice with trembling. It's almost paradoxical, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, but it talks about, this is the beauty of the true fear of the Lord, that you know who he is, so you honor him, and in that sense you tremble before him. But in knowing who he is and trembling before him, you are able to rejoice. So this is actually a call not just to forsake your plans of trying to rebel against the Lord, but realize that the other option is one which will bring great joy. Great joy. And so they are called to do homage to the Son. And this is amazing, because in the Hebrew Scriptures, God doesn't give honor to anyone except himself. And yet now, these kings are called to give honor to his Son.
Yes, indeed. So that brings us back to that word, Baal, the Aramaic word. And again, it's interesting to see and to raise the question, in verse 11 and verse 12, we again have two characters. Serve the Lord, serve Yahweh with fear and rejoice with trembling, kiss the Son.
And it seems that when it says, for his wrath, that he not become angry.
Right, the Son might become angry. It seems
the Son, but that is obviously only God's prerogative in a sense. So there's an amazing situation in this psalm of two characters.
Distinct
characters, and yet in many ways they're spoken of as in a unity.
Yeah, in terms fitting of God.
Yeah.
The ending of the psalm will give us the segue to our next episode. Blessed are all those who put their trust in him. We saw the word blessed opening the Psalter when we read Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who walks not, etc., etc. And now we close off Psalm 2 with the inclusio. Blessed are all those who put their trust in him. Do not walk in the counsel of the ungodly. Don't stand in the path of sinners. Do not sit in the seat of the scornful. Rather, put your faith in him. This is sort of the opening volley of the whole Psalter. These are the two psalms that have no superscript. All these details and more are waiting for us in the next episode.
Right. But maybe if we think just finally about actually, so the message of this is quite amazing. I mean, there is here an absolute. And the absolute is focused in the Lord. He is the one who declares. He is the one who declares who is the king. The king is the one in this understanding who he has the authority. And he will rule. And to him we need to give homage. But here's the amazing thing, that that on the one hand, if we look at it again as looking at the framework of this world and the thought of this world of wanting to rebel against or divulge ourselves of God's rule over us, we don't want him. We are the ones who are kings unto ourselves. We are law unto ourselves. This psalm comes diametrically against that and says, no, you might do that, but the Lord laughs at that. But here's the wonderful thing. If you are wise and are prepared to fear him and to kiss his Son, to give homage to his Son, and the word kiss is, I think, has this wonderful, rich meaning of both doing homage, but doing homage with both reverence and love.
Yeah, affection.
And affection. And that will then bring a huge blessing. And as you say, the end of this psalm then ends of those who do that, those who take refuge in him. And again, there's an ambivalence in him. Is the hymn talking about the Lord, or is the hymn talking about the Son, or is the hymn talking about them together? And here, that idea of taking refuge in him is a theme which we will see in many of the Psalms going forwards. To take refuge in him, to understand that outside of him, there's just a storm. And I think that's so relevant. I mean, we've been talking in previous podcasts about what's been going on in Israel right now, right? And I think, to my mind, this psalm speaks also directly into our situation here, where there are plans and there are plots and there are people thinking all their thoughts, but the Lord has his plan. And the focus of his plan is his King, his Messiah, his Son.
This is really good. This is encouraging also to set our minds on these words, even in this time. Yochanan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan.
It was a pleasure discussing the psalm with you. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in for another episode of the Tzur Institute's Biblical Research Podcast. Until next time, we say goodbye and shalom.